The rhythmic clatter of the mechanical keyboard was the primary sound Marcus tolerated. His office, a compact, meticulously organized space within the sprawling architecture of the regional research station, was his sanctuary. Here, amidst towering stacks of archival boxes and the faint, recycled air that always carried a metallic tang, Marcus navigated the intricate narratives of forgotten centuries. He was a historian, a scholar of the esoteric and the overlooked, his mind a fortress against anything that couldn't be substantiated by primary sources. Superstition, local folklore, whispered legends. These were simply data points, cultural artifacts to be cataloged, never embraced as truth. He had been tracing the lineage of a minor feudal lord, a figure largely dismissed by mainstream academia when the interruption occurred. A sharp rap on the frosted glass of his door. Marcus paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. Visitors were rare. His colleagues generally understood his preference for uninterrupted solitude. The door opened just enough for a hand to slide through, clutching a thick, cream-colored envelope. The hand belonged to a junior administrator whose face remained obscured. "For you, Professor Marcus," a voice stated, flat and devoid of inflection. The envelope was deposited on his desk, the door closing with a soft thud. Marcus picked up the envelope. The paper felt heavy, expensive. No sender's address, only his name and the research station's address, typed in an antique font. He tore it open with a precise, almost surgical movement. Inside, a formal letter, embossed with a legal firm's crest, announced the unexpected. His distant great-aunt, a woman he barely remembered, had passed away. And in him passing, he had bequeathed to him, Marcus Thorne, sole ownership of Blackwood Manor. He read the words again, Blackwood Manor. The name resonated with a faint, almost imperceptible chill, though he attributed it to the sterile air conditioning. He knew the name, of course, not from personal connection, but from his academic pursuits. Blackwood Manor, nestled deep within the forgotten moorlands of the northern county, was an architectural anomaly, a relic of a bygone era. It was also, he knew, a focal point for a particularly persistent cluster of local legends. Tales of strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and a pervasive sense of malevolence clinging to its ancient stones. Marcus scoffed, a quiet exhalation of air. Superstition, peasant fears given form by isolation and ignorance. He was a man of facts, of empirical evidence. A crumbling manor, however storied, was merely a collection of stone, timber, and decaying plaster. It held no power beyond what the human mind projected onto it. Yet, a peculiar thread of curiosity tugged at him. An ancient estate, uncatalogued, unstudied. The prospect of unearthing forgotten documents, perhaps even an unrecorded history, appealed to his scholarly instincts. He could dismiss the local tales, but he could not dismiss the potential for historical discovery. He would go. He would inspect the property, perhaps even liquidate it. But first, he would analyze. 2 days later, Marcus exchanged the familiar hum of the research station's servers for the guttural rumble of a hired vehicle. The driver, a taciturn man with a perpetually furrowed brow, navigated the increasingly narrow, winding roads. The landscape transitioned from cultivated fields to dense, untamed moorland. The sky, once a pale, indifferent gray, now pressed down, a bruised purple bruised with streaks of charcoal. Rain began to fall, not a gentle shower, but a persistent drumming assault against the vehicle's roof and windows. "Almost there," the driver grunted, his voice muffled by the downpour. Marcus peered through the streaked glass. Trees, skeletal and gnarled, clawed at the sky. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of wet earth, decaying leaves, and something else. A faint, metallic odor, like old iron left out in the rain, but sharper, more acrid. He dismissed it as a combination of dampness and the approaching structure. Then, through a sudden break in the storm-whipped foliage, it appeared. Blackwood Manor. turrets, sharp and menacing, pierced the bruised sky. The surrounding grounds were a tangle of overgrown ivy, skeletal rose bushes, and ancient contorted trees. A wrought iron gate, rusted and half open, sagged on its hinges, revealing a gravel drive choked with weeds. The vehicle crunched to a halt before the main entrance. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless rhythm against the stone walls. The air here was different, heavier, laden with the scent of damp earth, decay, and that persistent metallic tang. He stood before the massive oak door, intricately carved but now warped and peeling. No doorbell, no knocker. Just the raw, silent presence of the manor. The driver, without a word, deposited Marcus's single leather satchel on the gravel and quickly reversed, the vehicle's taillights receding into the gloom. Marcus was alone. He pushed against the door. It groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the soles of his boots before slowly, grudgingly opening inward. A blast of frigid, stagnant air assaulted him, carrying with it the undeniable stench of disuse and profound age. Dust, mildew, and something else. Something subtly organic, like dried blood or old meat, though he immediately rationalized it as merely the smell of ancient wood and damp plaster. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through a distant, grimy window. A grand staircase, its banister intricately carved, ascended into the gloom, its steps invisible beyond the first landing. The silence was absolute, save for the rhythmic drip of water somewhere deep within the house and the ceaseless drumming of the rain outside. He closed the massive door behind him. The click of the latch was disproportionately loud, final. He felt a peculiar pressure, a faint buzzing against his eardrums, as if the very air itself had thickened. It was merely the sudden change in atmospheric pressure, he told himself, the stillness after the journey. He stood in the vast, echoing entrance hall, his gaze sweeping over the intricate yet decaying details. Cobwebs draped like forgotten tapestries. The house felt less like an empty structure and more like a dormant, colossal organism. He tightened his grip on the satchel, a determined set to his jaw. An old house. Nothing more. He would approach this with the same methodical rigor he applied to any historical investigation. He would find the facts, dismiss the fictions, and perhaps uncover a forgotten truth. The tension in the air was simply the anticipation of a new project, a new challenge. He refused to acknowledge anything else. The removal of Marcus's effects from the regional research station had been a clinical exercise in logistics. Each archival box, each meticulously labeled binder, represented a segment of his life's work, a testament to his singular focus. Now, these same boxes stood stacked within the cavernous, dust-laced library of the manor, their uniform cardboard a stark contrast to the room's ornate, decaying grandeur. He attributed it to the sheer age of the structure, the accumulated exhalations of centuries. He began, as always, with organization. His system was infallible, honed over decades. Historical documents, arranged chronologically and by subject, were to occupy the central, most accessible shelves. Biographies to the left, architectural studies to the right. He worked with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision, unpacking the first box, sliding volumes onto the polished dark wood. The silence of the manor was profound, broken only by the rustle of paper, the soft thud of a book settling into place. It was a different kind of quiet than the research station, which always hummed with the distant thrum of servers and the muted conversations of colleagues. Absorbent. He glanced at the window, noting the faint tremor of the ancient glass in its leaded frame. A draft, undoubtedly. The manor was a sieve for the elements, a monument to neglected insulation. He shrugged, a slight shiver running down his back, and continued. His body often reacted to temperature fluctuations, a minor inconvenience. He straightened from where he'd been crouched, examining a lower shelf. The sound seemed to emanate from the wall beside him, or perhaps from the vast, unlit hallway beyond the library's open door. He held his breath, straining to hear. Nothing. Only the faint creak of the house settling, the distant, almost imperceptible sigh of old timbers. His hearing was excellent, a necessary tool for archival work, discerning the subtle differences in paper quality or the faint scratch of an old pen. He concluded it was the house itself, groaning under its own weight, perhaps the wind finding a particularly resonant cavity in the brickwork. The manor was old, after all, and old things made noise. He moved to a different section, placing a series of monographs on regional land ownership. He had just set down a small, worn volume detailing the manor's original construction when he turned to retrieve another from the open box. When he looked back, the worn volume was gone. Marcus frowned, a small line appearing between his brows. He was meticulous. He never simply misplaced things. He searched the immediate vicinity, checking behind other books, under the table. He distinctly remembered placing it on the second shelf from the bottom, to the left of the large legal atlas. He sighed, a rare exhalation of exasperation. Perhaps he'd been more fatigued than he realized, his memory playing a minor trick. He located the book minutes later, not on the adjacent shelf where he'd initially looked, but on a cart he'd used earlier for transport, several feet away, tucked beneath a stack of unrelated pamphlets. His system was flawless, his execution occasionally fallible. As dusk deepened, Marcus decided to take a break from the primary shelving. He began to explore the library's existing collection, hoping to find any relevant texts pertaining to the manor's history. Most were predictable. Dusty encyclopedias, forgotten novels, theological tracts. But as he ran his hand along a rarely touched section of a tall, narrow bookcase, his fingers brushed against an uneven surface. He pressed gently. A small panel, barely discernible amidst the carved wood, gave way with a soft click. They were smaller than standard, clearly intended for personal use. No titles, no author names. He pulled them out, the leather crumbling slightly under his touch. The first journal, dated nearly 2 centuries prior, bore the elegant, spidery script of a woman. Marcus opened it carefully. The initial entries detailed mundane household affairs, the weather, social visits. Then, a shift. The tone became more introspective, tinged with a growing melancholy. The quiet here presses in, a presence more substantial than any guessed. Marcus find myself forgetting small things. Where Marcus placed my embroidery. The precise words of a conversation. It is a minor affliction, Marcus tell myself. A product of age and solitude. He speaks to me, though there is no voice. A feeling, a suggestion. It is growing stronger. Marcus must resist. The walls watch. He recognized the pattern. Isolation, declining mental state, a descent into delusion. He'd seen similar accounts in his research, particularly among reclusive figures. He picked up the second journal, its cover even more dilapidated, the script within a frantic, almost illegible scrawl. This one was dated a generation later. They feed on my thoughts, twisting them. My memories, they are not my own. Fragments, broken glass. Whose life did Marcus live? It demands more. It always demands more. My strength ebbs. My mind unravels. Marcus, am becoming a vessel. The house. It breathes. And it hungers. The final entry was a single smeared word, barely legible. Consumed. Marcus closed the journals, the brittle leather sighing. He placed them carefully on the polished desk. His initial assessment remained. The isolated lives of the manor's former inhabitants had clearly taken their toll, resulting in escalating paranoia and eventual psychosis. The language, while florid and dramatic, was consistent with individuals experiencing profound psychological distress. Yet the precise echo of the woman's words in the later man's journal, the shared sensation of a malevolent presence, was a curious coincidence. Marcus closed the journals, the brittle leather sighing. He placed them carefully on the polished desk. The language, while florid, simply reflected the era's dramatic sensibilities, not supernatural occurrences. He had designated the Grand Library as his primary research station. Its towering shelves, laden with centuries of forgotten knowledge, now held his own meticulously organized stacks of documents, maps, and transcribed notes. A powerful lamp cast a harsh, focused light onto his workspace, pushing back the encroaching shadows of the cavernous room. Outside, the wind had picked up, a low moan that seemed to resonate with the ancient timbers of the house. He found himself pausing more frequently, listening, attributing the faint groans and creaks to the building settling, or the mere passage of air through its vast empty spaces. The first distinct deviation from the mundane occurred during a late-night session. He was cross-referencing a faded ledger from the mid-18th century, documenting household expenditures, when a whisper brushed past his left ear. It was not a draft, nor the rustle of paper. It was a sound, faint and indistinct, like dry leaves skittering across stone. He froze, pen hovering above the page. Nothing. The air was still, thick with the scent of old paper and dust. He dismissed it as auditory pareidolia, a trick of an overtired mind. He pushed on, determined to complete the comparison before resting. They were never direct, always at the edge of hearing, like a conversation happening in an adjacent soundproofed room. A murmur of voices, too low to discern words, too persistent to ignore. Sleep offered no reprieve. He saw himself trapped within the manor's walls, the stone pressing in, his skin growing rough and porous, becoming one with the crumbling mortar. Despite the growing unease, Marcus maintained his methodical approach. His skepticism, though frayed at the edges, was a stubborn, ingrained part of his intellect. He reasoned that the isolation, the sheer quiet, was playing tricks on his senses. He needed more data. He delved deeper into the manor's archives, unearthing forgotten correspondence, property deeds, and even local parish records that touched upon the various inhabitants. What he began to uncover was not the simple tale of isolated eccentricity he had initially surmised. A disturbing pattern emerged, stark and repetitive. The manor had seen a succession of owners, each arriving with ambition or a desire for solitude. Yet, almost without exception, their tenures ended abruptly and tragically. There were documented cases of profound melancholia escalating to self-harm, sudden, unexplained disappearances that baffled local constabularies. Marcus cross-referenced names, dates, and the precise duration of their stays. The pattern was undeniable, a macabre thread weaving through centuries of ownership. Those who spent prolonged periods within the manor's walls, especially those who lived in isolation, invariably met a grim fate. He looked around his research station at the stacks of documents, the old maps, the very walls that enclosed him. The doctor's hurried scrawl, detailing a mind reduced to a sieve, his spirit a hollow echo, had chilled Marcus more than any spectral tale. He sat in the drawing room, the manuscript open on the polished mahogany. Outside, the perpetual gray of the estate hung heavy, pressing against the leaded panes. He ran a thumb over the brittle paper. The ink faded, yet the words retained their bite. It was a clinical observation, not a fanciful yarn. Still, he reasoned, the previous owner, a solitary figure named Alistair Finch, might have simply succumbed to the pressures of isolation, perhaps an early onset of dementia. The manor, with its oppressive silence and echoing corridors, could easily exacerbate such a decline. Marcus, a man grounded in empirical fact, felt a familiar resolve hardening within him. He rose and moved towards the library, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. A fine layer of dust, like powdered history, coated every surface. He attributed it to the house's inherent decay, the slow entropy of forgotten things. As he reached for a leather-bound volume on local history, a flicker caught his eye. Not in the room, but behind it, a translucent ripple in the very air as if heat shimmered off an invisible flame. For a fraction of a second, he saw a woman's face, pale and contorted in silent anguish, her mouth open in a soundless scream. Then, it was gone, replaced by the undisturbed wall of books. Marcus blinked, shaking his head. Fatigue. The long hours of research, the unsettling atmosphere of the manor, they were playing tricks on him. He rubbed his temples, a dull ache throbbing there. He spent the rest of the afternoon in the makeshift research station he had set up in a rarely used antechamber near the main hall. The antechamber had been cleared of most of its antique clutter, its high ceiling and single tall window offering a deceptive air of normalcy. He was compiling a timeline of previous owners, searching for patterns, for any common thread beyond the alleged curse. He cross-referenced genealogical records with local land deeds, the rhythmic click of his keyboard, a small comfort against the manor's vast quiet. He was focused on a particular period, the late 18th century, when the manor had changed hands 3 times in less than a decade. It felt like a presence, a watchful stillness that settled behind his neck. He paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. The air in the research station grew heavy, stagnant. He spun his chair around, expecting to see a draft, or perhaps a shadow cast by the setting sun. There was nothing. Only the dimming light filtering through the window, painting the room in shades of gray. He turned back to his screen, dismissing the sensation as an overactive imagination. But then, it happened again. The metallic tang in the air intensified, acrid and sharp, like old blood. And this time, it brought a sound. A faint, distant weeping. A woman's voice, thin and reedy, weaving through the deeper thrum of the house. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk. He knew these sounds were not merely echoes of the past. They felt immediate. The weeping grew louder, morphing into guttural sobs, punctuated by the clatter of what sounded like falling crockery, then a shattering crash. He saw it then, not just a flicker, but a full momentary tableau. The research station blurred, replaced by a grand dining hall. A woman, her face streaked with tears, stood over a broken plate, fragments of porcelain scattered at her feet. A man, his back to Marcus, stood across the room, his posture rigid, shoulders hunched. The air crackled with unspoken fury. Then the dining hall dissolved, and he was back in the research station, his breath ragged, the scent of dust and ancient stone returning. The weeping had ceased. The silence was absolute, but it felt different now. It was no longer merely the absence of sound. It was a deliberate quiet, a holding of breath. He was not alone. The sense of being observed was now undeniable, a constant pressure, like an invisible weight pressing on his chest. It wasn't the fleeting feeling of a benign spirit. He felt his thoughts, his private interpretations of the manor's history, being scrutinized, perhaps even drawn out of him. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very stones and timber of the manor were pores, absorbing his consciousness. He had always believed that history was a narrative to be uncovered, analyzed, understood. Now he was beginning to comprehend that in this place, history was not a story. It was a living, malevolent presence, replaying its traumatic memories, and it was watching him, waiting, slowly beginning to absorb. Now he was beginning to comprehend that some narratives were not merely observed, but experienced, not merely studied, but inhabited. A subtle, insidious current seemed to hum through the very timbers of the house, a low thrum that resonated not in his ears, but deep in his bones. He should leave. The thought was a dull, insistent ache behind his eyes. He should step outside, breathe air untainted by ancient dust and the scent of slow decay. He should check on the world beyond these walls. The solicitor. He needed to call the solicitor about the paperwork, the utilities, the very legality of his presence here. He dialed the number, his finger pressing hard against the cold glass. The line crackled, a dry, papery sound, then nothing. A dead tone. He tried again, then a third time. Always the same, an empty, unresponsive silence that seemed to swallow his attempts whole. Perhaps the signal was poor. He moved towards the tall, arched window of the research station, a pane of aged glass that overlooked the overgrown gardens. He held the phone aloft, a vague hope fluttering. Still nothing. He tried a colleague, a historian from the university, someone who might wonder about his prolonged absence. It rang and rang, then stopped. No voicemail, no answering service, just an abrupt cessation of sound, as if the connection had been severed by an unseen hand. It was too much effort. He considered walking out. The front door was merely steps away, down the long, echoing corridor. He could simply open it, step into the waning afternoon light. He pushed himself away from the desk, a wave of unexpected lethargy washing over him. His movements felt sluggish, as if the air itself had thickened, grown dense and resistant. The house seemed to settle around him, the faint creaks and groans of its structure growing louder, more insistent, like a living thing shifting its weight. He imagined the ancient timbers groaning, the stone walls pressing in, a vast, silent sigh from the very foundations. It was a subtle, almost comforting sensation, like sinking into a deep, soft bed after prolonged exhaustion. The outside world, with its demands and its expectations, suddenly seemed sharp, jarring, undesirable. He paused, his hand hovering near the doorframe, then slowly, almost imperceptibly turned back. The research station felt safe, contained. Days bled into a hazy continuum. Marcus found himself increasingly disinclined to attend to the mundane necessities. His clothes, once meticulously chosen for their practicality, were now wrinkled, often stained with dust or spilled tea. Meals became irregular, forgotten, or consumed without thought, stale biscuits and lukewarm coffee sustaining him. The house had him. He felt it not as a threat, but as an undeniable possessive presence. It was a subtle drain, a siphon on his energy, his will. His thoughts, once sharp and analytical, now drifted, coalescing around the house's history, its secrets, its very being. He spent hours simply sitting in the research station, not actively reading, but merely staring at the brittle pages, feeling the weight of the past seep into him. The manor wasn't just influencing him, it was becoming a part of him. Or he, a part of it. The lines blurred. He saw fleeting shapes in the periphery of his vision, gone the instant he tried to focus. He no longer desired to leave. The house had a strange comfort, a deep, pervasive quietude that muted the clamor of his own mind. He was tired, perpetually so, but it was a comfortable exhaustion, a surrender. The outside world had ceased to matter, its concerns fading into an indistinct hum. Here, in the ancient manor, in the heart of his research station, he was precisely where he was meant to be. He was isolated, yes, but no longer alone. He had the house, and the house had him. The lingering impression of another's memories, the faint, acrid scent of old paper and something metallic, clung to the air, a phantom residue. The solid floor beneath his feet felt less substantial, more like a thin crust over an abyss of forgotten lives. He pressed a hand to his temple, a dull ache throbbing behind his eyes. A flash of an unfamiliar face, framed by severe spectacles, flickered in his mind's eye. A brief, sharp pang of loss, not his own, resonated within his chest. "Eleanor," a voice whispered, not his, but undeniably present. Marcus blinked, shaking his head. There was no Eleanor. He had never married. This was his life, his solitary pursuit of obscure historical truths. Yet the sensation of profound affection, swiftly followed by a desolate emptiness, felt acutely real. He was Marcus, a historian. That was a fact. He took a slow, deliberate breath, attempting to anchor himself in the present moment, in the physical space of the research station. The shelves of decaying texts, the heavy oak desk, the single flickering gas lamp. These were his reality. But the subtle shift in perception persisted. He glanced at his reflection in the glass of a framed photograph, an image of a stern-faced man from the late 19th century. For a fragmented instant, the stranger's eyes seemed to hold his own, a recognition that was deeply unsettling. The lines of the man's mouth, the set of his jaw, felt suddenly familiar, as if he had worn that expression himself. He turned from the desk, intending to exit the research station through the door he knew led to the main corridor. His hand reached for the familiar brass knob, but his fingers met smooth, unbroken wood. There was no door. The wall was seamless, adorned with a faded tapestry depicting a hunting scene he did not recall ever seeing in this room. Marcus stared, his mind struggling to reconcile the contradiction. He had entered through that door mere hours ago. He had seen it, touched it. Now, it was gone. This was not a trick of the light, not an illusion born of fatigue. The architecture itself had changed. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping the research station. The layout was subtly different. The fireplace itself, which had been functional, now appeared bricked up, a rough, uneven patch of mortar obscuring the opening. The air, too, had shifted, carrying a faint, cloying sweetness like decaying orchids. A profound disorientation settled over him. Was he truly in the research station? Or had he somehow stumbled into another part of the manor, a section he had never discovered? He moved cautiously, his boots scuffing softly on the polished floorboards. He ran a hand over the tapestry, the threads rough beneath his fingers. No hidden latch, no secret panel. Just solid wall. He walked to where the door should have been, tracing the invisible outline with his hand. His memory was clear. He had pushed it inward, the hinge groaning softly. Now nothing. This was impossible. Buildings did not simply reconfigure themselves. Perhaps he was dreaming. He pinched his arm, a sharp, undeniable pain, not a dream. His heart began to beat a quick, erratic rhythm against his ribs. He was not merely observing. He was inside the narrative now, an unwilling participant. He remembered a fleeting thought from earlier about a long-dead resident, a cartographer obsessed with the house's shifting dimensions. Had that been his thought or an echo? He looked down at his hands, then at his reflection again in the glass. It felt distant, like a word learned from a forgotten language. My name is Marcus. But the conviction was weak, fragile. The manor pulsed around him, a living, breathing entity, its stone walls shifting, its wooden floors groaning, its very architecture a physical manifestation of his rapidly deteriorating mental state. The research station, once a place of study, had become a cell, and the keys to his own identity seemed to have vanished with the door. Marcus stood within the research station, his legs unsteady. Now, the very fabric of that understanding felt stretched, translucent. He braced a hand against the cold, unyielding surface of a heavy oak desk, its polished top reflecting the dim glow of the single lantern. His gaze swept over the meticulously organized shelves, filled with leather-bound tomes and brittle folios, each a testament to lives lived and forgotten within these walls. He had spent weeks here, dissecting records, meticulously cross-referencing, building a timeline of the manor's occupants. He had sought facts, dates, motives. What he found instead were echoes. The metallic scent intensified, no longer a phantom, but a distinct tang, like copper left on a wet blade. It seemed to emanate from a specific section of the wall, behind a tall, narrow bookcase filled with uncatalogued journals. Marcus approached cautiously, his breath catching in his throat. The air here was colder, thin, almost sharp. It felt unnervingly warm, as if recently handled. He pulled the journal free. Its weight was disproportionate to its size, dense, almost heavy with a hidden mass. Flipping it open, Marcus found no title page, no author. The earliest entries were coherent, detailing the daily life of a former occupant. A scholar, by the sound of it, obsessed with the manor's architectural anomalies. Then, the script began to waver. Dates became erratic, logic fractured. "The walls listen," one entry read. The ink smeared as if the hand trembled. "It takes little pieces. My thoughts are not my own." Another scrawled diagonally across a page. "The dreams. They are not mine. I remember things I never did, places I never saw." Marcus's own memories felt suddenly distant, like photographs fading in a forgotten album. The specifics blurred, edges softening. He turned to the final pages. The writing was barely legible, a chaotic scrawl of symbols and desperate pleas. It feeds on what makes us us. The bright parts, the sharp parts. The metallic scent was now overpowering, a cloying sweetness beneath the copper. He realized it wasn't just metal. It was blood. Dried, ancient, but potent. A sudden sharp pain lanced behind his eyes, a sensation of something being pulled. He stumbled back, dropping the journal. It landed with a soft thud, pages splaying open to reveal a drawing. It was crudely rendered, but unmistakable. A sprawling, intricate depiction of Blackwood Manor itself. Its windows like vacant eyes, its gables like grasping claws. And at its base, tiny, indistinct figures, like motes of dust, being drawn into the structure. Above the drawing, in thick, desperate strokes, was a single word: consumes. The clinical detachment Marcus usually maintained shattered. This wasn't a haunting. This wasn't a spectral presence. This was something far more ancient, far more visceral. The manor wasn't merely a place where things happened. It was the architect of them, a living, predatory entity. It was the sound of digestion, the sound of a vast, unseen maw working. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the impossible. A sentient house. A house that fed. On memories, on sanity, on the very life force of its inhabitants. It explained the rapid decay of the scholar's mind, the fragmented histories, the pervasive sense of loss that clung to the estate like mist. Each occupant, a meal. Each memory, a nutrient. He was a historian, a man who sought patterns, understood causality. And the pattern was horrifyingly clear. The manor lured them in, scholars and recluses. Those who delved deep, who had rich inner lives, rich memories to offer. It wanted the vibrant, complex tapestry of a human mind. And he, with his singular obsession with history, his vast reservoir of knowledge and recollections, was its current preferred meal. He wasn't just living in a haunted house. He was trapped inside a biological process. He was being consumed, slowly, deliberately, by the very place he sought to understand. The lingering acrid scent, the metallic tang. It wasn't just the residue of previous victims. The manor wasn't just watching him. It was savoring him. And it was hungry. The specifics blurred, edges softening. A cold dread, unlike any academic apprehension, began to coil in Marcus. He stared at the ornate, gilded mirror in the great hall, expecting to see a stranger's face. His reflection, though his own, seemed translucent, a faint echo against the deepening shadows of the manor. A memory, sharp and unbidden, pierced the fog. The scent of pipe tobacco and old leather from his grandfather's study. The specific weight of a first edition. The precise angle of light on a particular afternoon. It was a fleeting jolt, a flicker of his former self, a defiant spark against the encroaching emptiness. He was Marcus. He was here. And this house, this entity, It was stealing him. A frantic thrumming started beneath his ribs. This was not mere forgetfulness. It was an active erasure. He had to fight. The thought solidified, hardening into a desperate resolve. His gaze swept the hall, no longer merely observing, but searching, scrutinizing. He remembered scraps of his earlier research. Fragmented tales of previous inhabitants, their desperate, often futile attempts to resist. They sought answers, not just history. He needed their answers. Ignoring the insistent pull towards the comfortable, heavy armchair by the dormant fireplace, Marcus moved. His steps were uneven, a strange lightness in his limbs conflicting with the leaden weight of his thoughts. The very air grew thick, like breathing through gauze. His fingers, surprisingly steady despite the internal tremor, found a slight unevenness near a heavy tapestry depicting a hunting scene. He pushed, pulled, pressed. Nothing. He tried again, tracing a specific pattern in the wood, recalling an obscure architectural detail from a faded blueprint he'd once examined. A soft click echoed, impossibly loud in the hushed hall. A section of the paneling slid inward, revealing a narrow, dust-choked passage. He hesitated only a second. This was a gamble, a plunge into deeper unknowns, but staying still was a guaranteed surrender. He squeezed through, the panel sliding shut behind him with a soft thud that severed him from the familiar part of the manor. He shuffled forward, his hand brushing against unseen cobwebs that clung to his skin like phantom fingers. A low hum, barely perceptible, vibrated through the stone beneath his feet. It was not a mechanical sound, but something organic, deep, and resonant. A faint, greenish glow emanated from ahead. He emerged into a cavernous subterranean chamber, unlike anything he had seen in the manor's public areas. This was not a study, not a library in the conventional sense. This was a research station, a place where someone had dedicated their existence to understanding the malevolence that now gripped him. Its light revealed intricate diagrams etched into the tabletop itself, swirling patterns that seemed to pulse with the faint green luminescence. Marcus approached the table, his eyes scanning the documents. The script was archaic but decipherable, filled with detailed observations, theories, and increasingly frantic warnings. He picked up a brittle journal. The handwriting was precise, meticulous, until the later entries, which devolved into desperate scrawls. The author, an ancestor named Elias, had chronicled the manor's parasitic nature, its ability to consume memories and identities. Elias had called it the Architect of Oblivion. Then Marcus saw it. A series of diagrams, annotated with precise, almost surgical instructions. They depicted a complex array of symbols surrounding a central cavity, within which rested an object, a shard of obsidian, not naturally occurring but clearly worked, its surface etched with minute, almost invisible lines. The accompanying text described it as a memory anchor, an artifact that, when properly activated with specific incantations and a rare volatile substance, could momentarily sever the manor's connection to its inhabitants, potentially even crippling its influence. The text warned of immense danger, of the ritual's fragility, and the terrifying backlash if it failed. It spoke of a temporary window, a desperate chance. The obsidian shard itself was described as the heart of stolen time, an object capable of holding and reflecting the manor's own accumulated history, turning its power against itself. Elias had not just researched. He had formulated a countermeasure. As he absorbed the implications, the low hum in the chamber intensified, vibrating through his bones, rising in pitch. It knew. It sensed his discovery. But the detailed instructions, the precise diagrams burned in his mind. He had found a weapon, a terrifying, perilous opportunity. He had a path, however narrow and treacherous, to reclaim himself. The precise surgical diagrams lay spread across the desk in the research station, illuminated by the harsh, solitary beam of his desk lamp. Marcus traced the intricate symbols surrounding the central cavity. his gaze fixed on the depicted shard of obsidian. It was not merely a rock. It was a focal point, an anchor. The manor was not merely old stone and wood. It was an intricate, malevolent mechanism, and this shard was its heart. A draft, sharp and frigid, snaked through the room, stirring the loose pages. Marcus shivered, not from the cold, but from the dawning comprehension. Now the legends felt like blueprints. His fingers, trembling slightly, reached for his notes, correlating the symbols with the cryptic historical records he'd unearthed. It wasn't the creak of settling timbers. It was a sustained, conscious sound, like a vast, ancient throat clearing itself. He stood, pushing away from the desk. His plan was forming, a desperate, half-formed strategy based on the diagrams. He needed to access the lower levels, beneath the oldest foundations, where the true core of the manor's malevolence resided. He moved towards the door, his hand reaching for the brass knob. Just as his fingers brushed the cold metal, the door slammed shut with a concussive force that rattled the glass in the windows. Dust motes danced wildly in the lamp's beam. A jolt went through him, a raw surge of adrenaline. This was no accident. The manor was fighting back. He yanked at the knob, but it was locked, fused. He could hear the distinct click of tumblers, then the heavy thud of a deadbolt sliding into place. A low, guttural growl echoed from beyond the wood, a sound that seemed to come from the very structure of the house. Marcus turned, his eyes scanning the room. A window, perhaps. He crossed to it, pushing aside the heavy velvet curtains. The glass was opaque, not merely dirty, but coated with a thick, viscous grime that seemed to writhe and shift. A faint, cloying sweetness, like decaying flowers, filled his nostrils. Suddenly, a spectral figure coalesced in the reflection. Her mouth opened, but no sound emerged, only a silent, agonizing scream that twisted her features. Marcus instinctively recoiled, a gasp catching in his throat. He stumbled back, his breath ragged. The figure dissolved, leaving only the writhing grime on the glass. He knew then that the battle had begun in earnest. The manor was not merely influencing, it was actively resisting, manifesting its malevolence. He moved to a heavy bookcase, one that abutted an older section of the house, suspecting a hidden passage. As he strained against it, the floor beneath him shifted. A deep crack spiderwebbed across the flagstones, extending from beneath the bookcase toward the center of the room. He couldn't discern words, only the overwhelming sensation of desperate pleas and furious accusations. They swirled around him, tugging at his clothes, plucking at his hair. He felt phantom hands on his shoulders, pushing him, trying to turn him, to pull him deeper into the swirling vortex of sound. He squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, gripping the edge of the bookcase, trying to ground himself. When he opened them, the research station was gone. He stood in a vast, echoing hall, lined with weeping portraits, their eyes following him, dripping black tears. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. A child's whimpering echoed from a distant archway. This was the manor's true form, its memory, its agony. He forced himself to focus on the diagram still visible on his desk, a beacon of purpose in the encroaching nightmare. The obsidian shard. That was the key. He pushed against the bookcase again, his muscles screaming. The floor continued to crack, the vibrations shaking his bones. The sounds of the manor's torment abruptly dulled, though the phantom pains lingered. He scrambled through the opening, gasping for breath, leaving the spectral figures and the collapsing floor behind. He was no longer trapped, but he was certainly not free. He was deeper within the manor's labyrinth, its malevolent heart beating louder with every step. His research, painstakingly pieced together from fragmented journals and the house's own spectral whispers, had led him to this conclusion. The shard wasn't just a symbol, it was the house's heart, its memory core, its ravenous maw. And he knew where it was hidden. He rose, the chair scraping against the bare floorboards. A chill, distinct from the dampness of the research station, permeated the air. It felt less like a draft, and more like an unwelcome presence pressing in. Marcus gathered the few items he considered essential. A heavy wrought iron mallet, a chisel with a finely ground edge, and a small leather-bound volume of archaic script. A last resort, a prayer disguised as a ritual. He was determined, but the house knew. Stepping out of the research station, the familiar corridor seemed to stretch, its proportions subtly distorted. Each floorboard groaned beneath his weight, but the sounds were not merely structural. He had identified the core's location from the architectural plans he'd unearthed. A hidden chamber beneath the oldest wing, accessible only through a disused servant's passage, long since bricked over. As he navigated the labyrinthine halls, the house began its assault. The temperature plummeted, and his breath plumed in front of him, white and fleeting. A distant wail echoed, a sound both mournful and enraged, seemingly originating from everywhere and nowhere. It was a cacophony of lost voices, a chorus of despair that threatened to overwhelm his resolve. He pressed on, his jaw tight, refusing to acknowledge the phantoms. He found the passage, obscured by a tapestry woven with faded scenes of hunting. Behind it, a crudely mortared section of stone. He raised the mallet. The first strike sent a shudder through the wall and through Marcus himself. The house reacted with a surge of energy. The air around him crackled, and a sudden, violent gust of wind tore through the supposedly sealed passage, extinguishing his lantern. Panic threatened to rise, but he fought it down. Clinical observation, he reminded himself, not surrender. He fumbled for his reserve light source, a small modern flashlight, its beam a meager spear against the suffocating black. He ignored them, focusing on the rhythmic swing of the mallet, the satisfying thud as stone crumbled. Each impact vibrated through his bones, a primal battle against ancient stone. Finally, a section gave way, revealing a narrow, gaping hole. A foul odor, a mix of stagnant water and something indescribably organic, wafted out. He dropped into a small, claustrophobic chamber. The walls were not stone or wood, but a calcified organic growth, pulsating with a faint, sickly green luminescence. It was like being inside a colossal, petrified organ. In the center, embedded within a jagged, crystalline growth that resembled a monstrous frozen flower, was the obsidian shard. This was the core. He saw flashes, a woman's face contorted in agony, a man screaming silently, children cowering. His hands, though, remained steady. He knew this was its final defense. The chisel felt impossibly light in his hand, the mallet impossibly heavy. The organic growths around the shard seemed to writhe, retracting slightly as he neared, like living tissue recoiling from a surgical instrument. He positioned the chisel against the crystalline structure anchoring the obsidian, taking a deep breath. This was the threshold. This was the moment. He raised the mallet, the act a defiant challenge against the ancient, consuming entity. He would either sever its hold or be consumed himself. He understood it now, with a clarity that felt both liberating and terrifying. This was the house's core, its heart, its digestive organ for memories and consciousness. The diagrams, unearthed from a hidden compartment within the manor's oldest library, detailed not architecture, but a kind of biological engineering, an occult anatomy. They showed how to disrupt the flow, how to sever the connection, or perhaps how to redirect it. A tremor ran through the floorboards, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through the soles of his boots. It was no structural shift. It was a pulse, the house's accelerated beat. Whispers, faint at first, then growing into a low murmur, began to eddy around him, a cacophony of forgotten voices. They were not distinct words, but a sensation of language, a relentless pressure against the inside of his skull. He felt the house reaching, its tendrils of influence probing, seeking purchase in the fragile architecture of his mind. He gripped the obsidian shard he had carefully extracted from a crumbling niche in the manor's deepest cellar. The diagrams indicated a precise insertion point within the central cavity depicted, a specific angle, a particular depth. It was a gamble. His resolve was a brittle, sharp thing, honed by weeks of relentless study and the encroaching pressure of the manor's malevolence. He would not become another forgotten echo, another fragmented memory consumed by this parasitic entity. He could feel the house attempting to disorient him, to dilute his focus. Familiar objects on his desk, a pen, a stack of notes, his half-empty mug, wavered at the edges of his vision, their forms momentarily blurring, threatening to dissolve. He blinked, forcing himself to anchor to the tangible. The obsidian shard in his hand, the brittle parchment of the diagrams, the insistent hum of the desk lamp. These were real. He had to believe they were real. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the air burning in his lungs. The house was pushing back, not with physical force, but with a psychological assault designed to shatter his identity. Memories, vivid and unbidden, flashed through his mind. His mother's laugh, the scent of pipe tobacco from his grandfather's study, the quiet satisfaction of a solved historical puzzle. They were not his own memories, not truly. They were echoes, fragments of countless lives absorbed by the house, now hurled at him, a desperate attempt to overwhelm his own consciousness, to make him one with the undifferentiated mass of its past inhabitants. He saw faces, indistinct and sorrowful, flickering in the periphery of his vision. They were the faces of the consumed, their silent pleas for release or absorption. He couldn't tell which. His hand, steady despite the internal tremor, moved to the central cavity marked on the diagram. It was not a physical opening in the room, but a conceptual one. A point of convergence where the house's essence was most concentrated. The diagrams showed this cavity as a swirling vortex, a singularity of the manor's power. The obsidian shard was not merely a tool. It was, as the ancient text implied, a fragment of the house's original binding. A piece of itself that had been separated and then reinserted by an unknown hand centuries ago, creating the very mechanism he now sought to disrupt. With a grunt of effort, Marcus pressed the shard into the designated spot. There was no resistance, no physical barrier. It was as if he was pushing it into liquid air, into a dimension just beyond the visible. A low, guttural moan resonated from the very foundations of the manor, a sound of profound agony that rattled the windows and sent dust motes dancing in the lamplight. He pushed further, feeling a strange resistance, not physical, but energetic, like plunging his hand into a powerful current. The obsidian shard began to glow with a faint, sickly green light, pulsing in rhythm with the house's distressed thrum. He clamped his jaw shut, refusing to cry out. He focused on the diagram, on the precise angle, on the specific depth, on the promise of severing the connection, of inflicting a wound that would cripple the entity. Then, a profound silence descended, absolute and terrifying. The thrumming stopped. The green light from the shard winked out, plunging the immediate area into a deeper gloom. Marcus stood, his arm outstretched, the shard now embedded in the conceptual cavity on the desk. He felt. The pain in his mind had vanished, replaced by an unnerving emptiness. He tried to recall his own name, his purpose, the reason he stood there. The memories were there, but they felt distant, as though he was reading them from a faded inscription. His own identity felt stretched, thin, porous. He looked around the research station. It seemed normal, mundane, the desk lamp still casting its solitary beam. He touched his face, his skin. It felt real. The house was silent, utterly still. Had he escaped? Or had he merely altered the nature of his absorption, becoming not a memory consumed, but a new, integrated part of the manor's vast, silent, and now profoundly wounded consciousness? He felt a new kind of awareness, a sense of the manor's deep roots, its stone bones, its vast, empty chambers. He felt the weight of its history, the lingering echoes of its countless inhabitants, not as an outside observer, but from within. The question of absorption or escape no longer seemed relevant. He simply was.